Thank you very much. I sincerely welcome you all to the Capital Markets Forum. We have 5 very distinguished panelists in this session, and unfortunately only 1 hour. And I also know that we are running behind the schedule. So I'll keep my introduction very short and then leave the floor to our valuable panelists. Today's discussion in this session will be the capital markets and the effects of recent changes in the liquidity conditions worldwide on the capital markets. As you know, after the Fed's mixed messages on the future of its bond buying program in May, financial markets have gone through a volatile period. And if you look at the foreign exchange rates, interest rates, and equity indices, we have seen sharp moves. Some also argued that this might be the end of the liquidity glut worldwide. But yesterday's Fed's announcement came as a surprise, and it seems that they delayed the decision on tapering its bond purchases. And if you look at the main financial indicators in the developed world and in Turkey as well, we have seen many markets are up today. And in the morning session of Borsa Istanbul, I guess it was 7.4% up. But these changes in the liquidity conditions and the Fed's recent announcement do not stop us asking some questions whether there is a change in the global risk appetite or the outflows from the emerging markets could be attached to structural problems, which there is any in these economies. Another question: how should regulators respond to such changes in times of turbulences? A wait-and-see policy or a preemptive strike at the problem? And also we ask if different financial instruments, including Islamic ones, are more immune, at least to some degree, to liquidity drains. So these are all very tough questions, but we have the right people in this panel to answer these questions. So I'll start with Mr. Abdul Ghani. Mr. Abdul Ghani is the Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer of CIMB Islamic. He's also the head of the group Islamic Banking and the country head for Middle East and Brunei of the CIMB group. CIMB group is the largest Asia-Pacific, excluding Japan, investment bank and one of the world's largest Islamic banks. And he has a very impressive CV. He has been recognized by top international publications as the top 20 pioneer in Islamic finance, Islamic Banker of the Year, and awarded the Outstanding Contribution to the Development of Islamic Finance Award for his role in the global Islamic financial markets. Badlisyah, the floor is yours.
Afternoon to everyone. Liquidity in the capital market is very key to its survival and its dynamism and its long-term success. So whenever there is any changes to global condition, at the end of the day, a lot of hiccups will be felt across the globe in the respective capital market. At the end of the day, when you talk about liquidity in the capital market, we would essentially be looking at domestic liquidity as well as global liquidity. At the end of the day, you can't run away from the two. And what is key to the survival of any capital market in any country is essentially domestic liquidity, because the whole world can crash around you if you have a very strong and deep market in the domestic sphere. You will be able to withstand any impact that comes from other parts of the world. So the decision of the Feds naturally do have a very, very strong impact in any capital market, including in Malaysia, Turkey, and anywhere else. So when they sneeze, everyone else falls sick, right? And when they become healthier, everyone becomes healthier as well. But to me, we should always focus on building the right infrastructure in our capital market so that we can manage the liquidity flow both from a domestic perspective as well as a foreign flow perspective or global flow perspective. And the right infrastructure is essentially to make sure local players, the economies of scale of the domestic market are enhanced so that liquidity can flow appropriately. And let me just touch a little bit on infrastructure. I mean, you have a capital market, whether it's debt capital market or equity capital market, but if you do not have a strong and good number of players in the market, you will not have an effective and efficient market because there is nobody to play in the market. Even if you have a good number of players, but if the players are not fully equipped with the right kind of framework internally, they will not be able to play right, and they will not be able to support the kind of activity that we desire in a capital market. And when you talk about the capacity and capability, in Malaysia, at one point, at the beginning of our capital market in 1990, we had a huge and ample liquidity that is latent in the banking sector. And the reason why it was latent, it was not utilized, was because none of the banks at that point of time were fully equipped with the right kind of framework to invest in the capital market. We were a bank and we do banking. We don't invest in capital market. Right? We do not have the investment framework that would allow our traders to go into the market in an effective manner. So we had close to 500 billion ringgit that was latent and was never utilized, either in the banking sector for syndicated facility or bilateral financing, or in the capital market. 500 billion was just in the interbank market. Right? So we meant infrastructure or framework means we must make sure our players have the right framework to effectively bring liquidity into the market. So if our players are not ready, then we become reliant on international players. And international players with their own liquidity and their own priority of investment, where they want to go, and their own credit appetite, then we become, as a capital market in any particular jurisdiction, very much dependent on global liquidity and everything that influences that liquidity. Right? We don't have control of our own capital market as a result. And then when you talk about other infrastructures to make sure that we have a good control of our own liquidity, is talking about regulation, talking about the framework that we put in place as a regulator or as the government to make sure that we facilitate liquidity in the market. Perhaps we talk about less income tax or less tax or zero tax on dividends for investments in shares in the stock exchange to facilitate liquidity in the equity market. Of course, some of this kind of discussion is very much moot in a more developed capital market, but it is something that is very relevant when it is discussed in less developed market in terms of capital market in many other jurisdictions. So all this necessary infrastructure needs to be put in place so that we can withstand any shock caused by tapering of quantitative easing. Right? All this becomes after the event. Like we should be focused on what do we do before the kind of crises that happen in America, the kind of crisis that happen in Western Europe could influence liquidity in our own market. We must figure it out to make sure that when that happens, we are not reliant on liquidity flows or outflows of liquidity from our market back to those jurisdictions. So in Malaysia, what we have done was to make sure that we have all this infrastructure in place so that when the crises happen or when decisions are taken to manage those crises in other parts of the world has minimal or practically zero impact on the operation of our capital market. In fact, less than 10% of any issuances done in Malaysia is allocated to foreign investors, for example, for corporate issuances, be it IPO or debt. But of course, naturally, the government debt, there are some significant holding by foreign investors, but then again, those are typical. I think before I end my opening remark, I will touch a little bit on Islamic finance and whether on the question of whether or not the different instruments that are available in Islamic finance would be able to help us manage liquidity better. I think at the end of the day, whether it's Islamic finance or conventional finance or Islamic capital market or conventional capital market, the operation of the capital market is effectively the same. Right? The economics and commercial consideration that we have, the infrastructure that we need, the dynamism of the market operation that we desire is exactly the same. There is no difference. Would Islamic finance help us be better? The answer is yes, but not because there is a difference in product, not because there is a difference in infrastructure and framework, but because we have a wider investor base, a wider liquidity pool that we can tap as a market. Right? So if the capital market in a particular jurisdiction have both sukuk market as well as the conventional bond market, the Islamic equity capital market as well as the conventional equity capital market, if we have that, we will be able to tap a larger pool of liquidity within our own market as well as the rest of the globe. So when there is a crisis that we experience, like the sovereign European debt crisis as well as the sub-debt crisis in America that impacted the conventional space, we would still be able to sustain our capital market using the liquidity available in the Islamic capital market. I think with that, ladies and gentlemen, I end my opening remark. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you very well explained how the Islamic capital markets instruments in Malaysia insulated very well from the effects of the recent financial crisis. Now the second speaker will be Dr. Eğriboyun. Mr. Feyzullah Eğriboyun is the Deputy Executive Vice President in charge of Treasury, Investor Relations and Financial Institutions and Funding Development in Bankasya. He's an engineer and he did graduate and postgraduate studies in mathematics, science. And he also worked as a financial engineer and strategist at various international investment banks in New York City and London between 1997 and 2011, and later on he joined Bankasya. And as we know, Bankasya is one of the most active players in the sukuk market in Turkey. So how would you
will I be able
reflect
to see the presentation? Should I go there or should I just speak from here?
So because the organizers have the presentation. Yeah, it's on.
Looks like that. Okay.
Thank you. I'm going to keep this actually very short, much shorter than what the presentation shows. And there are a lot of facts and figures here that I'm pretty sure you have seen several times probably. If you have been to any of Islamic finance, Islamic banking, or in general
Finance or banking conferences, it gives you a little bit of summary in slightly influent way actually, that global Islamic finance assets currently in the world is at $1.6 trillion. $1.6 trillion. 1.3 of that is Islamic banking, so it is predominantly banking industry. Islamic finance overall, it is about 80% of this, and if you see the growth rate, it actually has more than doubled from 2006 to 2012, from 0.6 trillion to 1.3 trillion. In a matter of 6 years, it more than doubled in size. And if we look at it by the region, it is mostly again dominated. 80% of it is GCC and MENA, Middle East and North Africa countries. Then we do have obviously Asia, Malaysia taking the biggest share of it, and then we do have Sub-Saharan Africa and others. This is just a summary. And if we look at by the asset size, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, these are all the very active countries. If you look at it again regionally, we see that in terms of sukuk issuances, which is an asset class in itself, and it has been a very famous asset class actually, which probably I should talk about a bit later. Malaysia is the dominant factor when it comes to sukuk issuance. As far as I know, I think the Malaysian government does not have any conventional bond outstanding, right? All it is sovereign issuances are actually in sukuk form.
For the dollar market, yes.
In the dollar market, yes, in the dollar market. And we do have then Qatar, UAE, and the others are coming. Turkey is taking only 1%. Obviously, I'm going to talk in general from a Turkish perspective, so we will talk about it later. There were types of it. Now I am going to actually focus more on the Turkish banking sector and the role of the participation banking in it. Participation banking, as we call it in Turkey, is what is known as Islamic bank otherwise in the world. It is a name that has been very aptly put in 2005. We liked it. We have been using it very actively actually. The total Turkish asset size is 1.6 billion trillion Turkish lira in the banking sector overall, and participation banks are only a tiny 85 billion of it. So in terms of the asset size, the share is about 5.5%. And in all the other categories, the banking categories in general, you can see that it is taking about 5 to 7%, 5 to 8% market share, which we are going to see now. But in terms of growth, both in terms of asset growth, cash loan and deposit growth, participation banks in the last 7-8 years have been growing much faster than their conventional counterparts, the deposit banks. From the system, from the deposit banks, and from the overall sector, they have been growing much faster. These are facts. These are what we have observed in the last 7-8 years, and here are the graphs. Are they more readable than over there than I can do here? Because I cannot read them. I really cannot. Here I am going to read it from here. In terms of asset size, it is 5.4%. But this is a number that's very important, I want to emphasize. It's a number that came from 2.4% market share to 5.4% market share in just 7 years, 8 years actually. It has more than doubled its market share. In an environment where the Turkish banking itself has been growing quite fast, you know, the last 7-8 years of Turkish banking sector, but in terms of market share, the participation banks are improving there. In terms of loans, deposits, and the equity, you can see the same level of outpacing the overall market in terms of in the participation banking. One thing that I want to point here is, you know, usually, this is off the presentation, usually we get the question that there are 4 participation banks in a system of 49 banks. And people see that the potential of participation banking in Turkey should be higher than 5.5%. You know, you guys have been in play for so long and you couldn't do it. I don't take it personally. I'm in this for only the last 2 years, but in general, I would like to defend it. If you look at the bottom right graph here, and I will tell you the number. In terms of the equity that the participation banks has in the system, it is 4.5% in terms of the equity. Then you look at the, in terms of asset size, the market share is 5.4%, 6.3 in terms of loans, 6.4 in terms of deposits. Now, how much money you put in, how much return do you get, how much market share do you get? If you look at it from that perspective, actually with 4.5% equity put in, the money that you have put in terms of the amount, the share that you get in the market is fair. It is actually a little bit more than fair. So unless there's a new equity coming in, new capital coming in, I don't think that that is something that we need to lose sleep over. We are trying to improve, obviously. It is a demand-driven industry, and it is actually growing with the demand that we see, especially from non-Istanbul parts of the country. But with the amount of equity it is in, I think these growth rates and the shares are fair. So if we continue, if we continue with the some of the other banking metrics, the efficiency, the asset quality, profitability, you can see all these pictures. They are pretty much in line with the rest of the industry. One point I want to make is on the right bottom corner, the graph there shows the capital of capital adequacy ratio of the participation banks. On average, they are lower than the conventional banks in the system. It is because of the model of the participation banking. By definition, this is interest-free banking. By definition, you cannot invest in government instruments, government papers. What is the thing about government papers? Well, they used to provide very good returns, but they are zero risk weight. So when it comes to capital adequacy ratio calculation, zero risk weight versus non-zero risk weight makes a huge difference. When your loan to asset ratio is 80% for a participation bank versus a loan to asset ratio for a typical deposit bank is 50%, the gap of this 30% is zero risk weight versus non-zero risk weight. Therefore, historically, the participation banks have been lower when they are ranked. They have been lower car banks, but this is exactly because this is not an apple-to-apple comparison. This is something I also wanted to emphasize in terms of evaluating their performance. Here I have made some analysis actually, how they have behaved vis-a-vis a few more minutes. In terms of asset growth, when before, during and after the financial crisis period, deposit banks versus the conventional banks versus the participation banks, we see that usually the correlations are positive. So they are increasing their assets together in overall with 0.5 correlation, which is quite a decent high positive correlation. In the financial crisis period, actually, it has turned slightly negative, almost flat. In terms of the loan growth, this is the same picture, but you see that actually before the crisis, during these very high growth years of participation banks, the correlation was almost, they were uncorrelated, -0.1. If you ignore it, they were almost uncorrelated because the participation banks were really growing very high in terms of their loans. But after the crisis, all the banking sector, along with the participation bank, actually rebound, and the loan growth actually is increasing. Besides, if I may say, the conventional banks in our system also have reinvented lending after the government rates have come down. So the banking is now done through lending again. So therefore, this correlation actually has improved to positive territory. In terms of the deposit growth, again, overall, there are positive correlation between conventional banks and participation banks in terms of the growth of the deposits. This is an interesting graph. If you can just, the dark one is participation banks, the black one. The red one is conventional banks, and the graph shows you the NPL ratios, the asset quality issues. This is one feature of participation banks that is quite actually obvious. Through the model, when participation banks are lending, actually they are receiving their principal back along with the profit share that they charge in monthly intervals. But conventional banks actually can wait 3 months, 6 months before receiving their interest. This puts the participation banks into kind of an early indicator situation. You can actually see that whenever there is a trouble, there is an economic distress in the market in general, participation banks are usually sensing it much earlier, because every month they are supposed to receive the profit shares from the companies that they have lent. If they do not in 1 month, 2 months in a row, then you can see that in general there is a distress in the system. Usually this is a well-known phenomenon that is tabulated in other studies as well. And one last thing is the capital adequacy ratio. I have told you the story about this. Especially if you look at the later part of it, you can see that the gap between conventional banks and the participation banks have improved a lot. I will conclude actually saying that in terms of the liquidity, which is the main actually theme of the panel, when there is a global liquidity, ample liquidity, as we have had until very recently, the participation banks are benefiting from it as well as the conventional banks. The bank that I am working at has quadrupled its international wholesale lending from end of 2010 to 12. In a matter of 2.5 years, in terms of dollars, it has gone from $400 million to $1.5 billion international wholesale funding. And I could get dollars internationally much better rates from the deposits, the dollar deposits that I can collect here within Turkey. So definitely, when there's ample liquidity in the system, global liquidity, we are going to benefit from that. And when this liquidity is cut, which eventually is going to be cut, whether like yesterday's event is going to delay it another 3 months or 6 months, we are going to obviously get hurt as well as the other conventional players as well. So in that sense, in terms of how the participation banks, the Islamic banking industry gets benefit or gets hurt from the international liquidity conditions, I think there's a high correlation there as well. The only thing is, just to give you an anecdotal example, last year, September 2012, Turkish Republic sovereign has made its first debut sukuk issuance, $1.5 billion. $1.5 billion, 41% of that, $615 million of that, came from what we call purely Islamic accounts. Purely Islamic accounts are the accounts that are not going to come to your conventional issuances. That is a money that you are not going to be able to tap if you had gone through a conventional issuance. That is, I think, my friend had also said before, the tapping new resources in terms of the liquidity is important. So in that sense, obviously, Islamic finance in general is going to help. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Feyzullah Bey. Our next speaker is Mr. Stephan Pouyat. Mr. Pouyat is the global head of international markets at Euroclear. In this capacity, he is the main contact person for dialogue and consultation with industry practitioners and market authorities. And we have a meeting right after this one with him. Earlier in his career, Mr. Pouyat worked for Federated Investors, where amongst other tasks, he invented web-based settlement engine. He's also a fellow Harvard alumnus. Mr. Pouyat, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I will actually continue a little bit along the line of yesterday on the financial center.
but with another angle here, which we focus on a theme that has been extensively mentioned yesterday on quality of growth. It's going to probably please my colleagues from Malaysia here, but the main points of capital sustainability is probably the variations between fundamentals and speculation. And here this is just a graph that shows how dramatic has been the late months of May and June and the summertime, especially for the Turkish market and a few others, whereby you can see the number of liquidity that have been pulled off the emerging market. And in fact, what we have analyzed in Euroclear, being part of the global system, is that there are some markets that are extremely, in fact, isolated. And they have very, very strong barrier to entries. And yet, those barriers that they have put in place have not protected them from the crisis. So we have a different view on what could be the right setup to maintain sustainability, even at crises of shocks that we've just seen recently. And of course, the first reaction that any country has when it's facing this type of shock is to think about even more stringent I would say, regulations, more stringent rules to protect even further the domestic market. And then you see a sort of an escalation between speculative people behavior and the market protectionist dimension. And yet the consequences of these two have a significant impact on the liquidity. So very, very importantly, domestic demands, and especially here in Turkey, the Islamic finance, Islamic sukuk is vital. But at the same time, if you protect your market, it's almost the opposite side of a desire to become an international financial hub. So the trick is, how do you open your doors without being exposed to this crisis? And actually, I think Malaysia has done a pretty good job there. So here, this is just a comparison between Indonesia and Malaysia. And you see in this graph, both countries in red and yellow are the size of foreign investors investing in those markets. Malaysia has been actually relatively lagging behind Indonesia, the red one being Indonesia here. And so you would say, wow, you know, Indonesia has done a great job in attracting foreign investors, and whereas you can see all the others still lagging behind, trying to catch up. But then when you look at, in fact, the type of investors that is behind a market like Indonesia versus Malaysia, then you see, and so you have to look at this graph, looking at the dark line being Indonesia and the red line being Malaysia. And this is, of course, the cost of funding for the government bonds in terms of bond yields. And you see that Malaysia is at 3.8% today, whereas Indonesia is at 8.5%. Why? They have the exact same level of exposure vis-à-vis the international world, and yet they have been much more resilient to the crisis that has happened. And we have seen in many other markets where we are present a similar, I would say, caution, protections behavior, and yet those markets are open to international market. So the reason is one that we are trying to bring here also to the Turkish market, is the type of investors that you have. You know, yesterday we talked about growth, but very importantly, when you're trying to open up and widen your investment base, making sure that you have less exposure to speculation, and that you have reliable investors in your system, people who are there for the long term. And one of the trend that we have seen is that despite the different crises in the systems of Euroclear, we have 23 trillions of assets under custody. It's a massive amount. And the people, the participants, the clients of Euroclear that are investing in those markets, they are looking for a very, very robust local infrastructure so that they can invest in the market long term. And that is this trust that is created between the international market base that we have in our books and the local market that creates this liquidity growth within the local market. So you can actually complement a very strong domestic strategy with an international strategy in such a way that you can reduce the earthquake shock that some other markets have for the time being. So of course this is an element when you want to try to open up your market, like the Turkish market, to become an international financial hub. You will be exposed by foreign investors. Foreign money is not necessarily a bad thing, but you have to design it properly. That's kind of my conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pouyat. The next speaker is Mr. Alp Keler. Mr. Alp Keler is the CEO of the AK Asset Management, and the company is one of the big four in the industry. Mr. Alp Keler is in the business for a long time, and he worked at the Koç Asset Management, Garanti Asset Management, ABN AMRO Asset Management, and before his position in the AK portfolio in Fortis Investments. And he's a former president of CFA Istanbul Society, and he's currently a board member of Turkish Institutional Investment Managers Association. Mr. Alp Keler, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank all the audience for your participation. Second, I prefer to do my presentation in Turkish because of the breakdown of this audience. Benim prezentasyonum 3 bölümden oluşuyor. Birinci bölümde ben emerging markets'lar hikayesinin devam ettiğini vurgulayacağım. İkinci bölümde özellikle son dönemde Fed'in politikalarının emerging market'lara etkilerini biraz inceleyeceğim ve bunun algımızı ve önümüzdeki dönemdeki beklentilerimizi aktaracağım. Üçüncü slaytta ise Türk sermaye piyasalarının mevcut durumu ve bu gelişmelerden nasıl etkileyeceğini aktarmaya çalışacağım. Çok klasik bir slide ama yani özellikle gelişmekte olan piyasaların hikayesinin devam ettiğini çok net bir şekilde söyleyebiliriz. Uluslararası yatırımcılar, institutional investorlar 5 tane ana faktöre bakmaktadır. Bunlardan birincisi growth, büyüme. Özellikle IMF'in şu andaki tahminlerine baktığımızda önümüzdeki dönemde 2017 yılı örneğin baktığımızda gelişmekte olan piyasalar 6.2% ortalama büyürken gelişmiş piyasalar 2.5% büyüyecek. Dolayısıyla aslında gelişmekte olan piyasalar hikayesi aslında devam ediyor ve bir müddet daha devam edecek. İkinci önemli hikayesi tabii ki favorable demographics. Baktığımızda özellikle gelişmekte olan piyasalarda ortalama medyan yaşın düşük olması ve önümüzdeki dönemde daha fazla aktif iş gücüne katılımının artması bu piyasalarda olan ilgiyi arttıracaktır. Bir başka faktör finansal istikrar, düşük ve stabil public debt rasyoları. Bildiğiniz üzere son yıllarda government ve GDP rasyolarında gelişmekte olan piyasalarda %40'ın altı rasyoları görmeye başladık. Bu gelişmiş piyasalarda %80-90'a çıktı. Önümüzdeki dönemde özellikle gelişmekte olan piyasalarda low debt GDP rasyosu bu ekonomik aktivitenin daha hızlı olacağını ve daha flexible olabileceği için bir yer olduğunu gösteriyor açıkçası. Dolayısıyla bu hikaye de devam ediyor. Dördüncü hikayemiz emerging markets are underrepresented in indexes. Birçok endekse baktığımızda özellikle şu sağdaki grafiğe özellikle emerging markets'ların GDP içerisindeki ağırlığı %60 olmasına karşın şu anda dünya borsaları içerisindeki endekslerindeki ağırlığı ise sadece %13-14 seviyelerinde. Dolayısıyla yeni alokasyonlar tabii ki dönem dönem etkileyecektir ama uzun dönemli trendlere baktığımızda bu alokasyonların içerisinde GDP %60 ise gelişmekte olan piyasalar daha fazla alokasyon edinecektir. Son olarak diversification offered by emerging markets. Gelişmekte olan piyasalar daha iyi bir getiri risk profili sunmaktadır. Genel hatlarıyla baktığımızda seviye çok önemli. Yatırım yaparken burada attractive valuation, bulunduğumuz seviyenin cazip olup olmaması çok önemli. Son dönemde yaşadığımız gelişmeler de aslında bu. Fiyat kazanç oranı 8,5'a düştüğünde ilgi çok arttı. Ama fiyat kazanç oranı çok yükseldiğinde ise ilginin azaldığını düşündük. Aslında bu uzun dönemli trendlerde ciddi şekilde çalışıyor. Ekonomi management, ekonomi yönetimi son yıllarda bu gelişmekte olan ülkelerde çok ilerledi. Brezilya, Çin ve Türkiye örneklerini gösterebiliriz. Political istikrar, 10 yılda çok farklı bir noktaya geldi. Finansal istikrar, özellikle debt rasyolarının, borç rasyolarının GDP'ye göre oranları düştüğü için olumlu yönde etkilendi. Emerging, gelişmekte olan ülkelerin hala baktığımızda faiz oranları göreceli olarak yüksek ve cazip fırsatlar sunuyor. Currency appreciation dönem dönem fırsatlar yaratabiliyor. Ve alokasyon, bizim tabii belki portföy yönetimi background'ımdan dolayı bunu söylüyorum. Alokasyon önümüzdeki dönemde uzun dönemli trendlerde çok daha gelişmekte olan piyasalara kaynağın gireceğini gösteriyor. Ama tabii ki bu dönem dönem çok fazla, dönem dönem az olacak. Ve özellikle son birkaç yılı incelemek gerekiyor ve bundan dolayı bazı çıkarımlarda bulunmak gerekiyor. Özellikle 2008 finansal krizi çok önemli bir sonuç doğurdu. Burada gelişmiş piyasaların merkez bankaları, Fed, son dönemde Bank of Japan, özellikle parasal genişlemeye başladılar ve bu parasal genişlemenin sonucunda da sağ üst slaytta göreceğiniz gibi özellikle gelişmekte olan piyasalara hisse senedi ve bono yatırımları çok ciddi şekilde artmaya başladı. Bu artış 2009'dan itibaren 2012 yılına kadar aralıksız sürdü. Ve bu dönem içerisinde sol alt slaytta gördüğünüz üzere gelişmekte olan piyasalar bütün dünya piyasalarından çok daha iyi bir performans gösterdi. Son dönemi bir kenara bırakırsak özellikle gelişmiş piyasaların çok üzerinde bir performans yakaladık. Tabii bazı dinamikleri de değiştirdi. 2007-2012 yılları arasında baktığımızda alttaki slide onu gösteriyor. Örneğin Türkiye'de bono piyasasına olan yabancı yatırımları %15-17 arttığını gözlemliyoruz. Bu tabii kırılganlığı arttırıyor. Özellikle Fed'in karar alması ve Fed'in kararları sonucunda kırılganlığın artması yabancı yatırımcı oranını arttıran ekonomilerde, arttıran piyasalarda etkisi daha kırılgan ve daha dalgalı olabiliyor. Amerika'dan çeşitli sinyaller geliyor. Özellikle gelişmekte olan piyasalar için iyi bir dönem yaşıyoruz. Yani son unemployment rakamı, işsizlik rakamı olsun, ev fiyatlarının artış rakamı olsun. Bunun yanında dünyadaki diğer ekonomilerin toparlanma sinyalleri aslında bu genişleme politikalarının yavaş yavaş sonuna geldiğimizi gösteriyor. Tabii burada Fed 22 Mayıs'ta bu açıklamayı yaptıktan sonra gelişmekte olan piyasalarda çok ciddi bir panik yaşandı. Bu paniğin etkilerini sağ alttaki slaytta, sağ alttaki grafikte çok net bir şekilde gözüküyor. Özellikle Mayıs-Haziran ayında son 4 yılda alıştığımızın dışında bir para çıkışı dönemi yaşadık. Mayıs-Haziran ayında bir para çıkışı yaşandı. Bu tabii gelişmekte olan piyasaların kurlarında olumsuz etki yaşattı. Özellikle cari açık problemi olan, sol alttaki slaytta gördüğümüz üzere cari açık problemi yaşayan ülkelerde %10'a kadar kur kayıplarına yol açtı. Fakat biz bu etkinin sudden stop mu ve temporary bir huzursuzluk mu olduğunu göz önüne aldığımızda tabii dünkü gelişmeler çok önemli. Bugün bu slaytları yaparken önceden hazırlanan slaytın üzerine konuşmak biraz zor oluyor ama en azından buradaki tezimi destekleyen bir sonuç çıktığını söyleyebilirim. Özellikle biz gelişmekte olan piyasaların dönem dönem gündemde olacağını düşünüyoruz. Uzun dönemli trendlerde. Belirli dönemlerde ilgi yüksek olacak, belirli dönemlerde ise daha çok gelişmiş piyasalara ilgi olacak. Biz bunu sudden stop'tan ziyade kısa dönemli bir rahatsızlık, piyasalardaki rahatsızlık olarak değerlendiriyoruz. Biz quantitative easing'in bu geçiş sürecinin biraz daha zamana yayılacağını düşünüyoruz. Tabii 2009-2012 yıllarında hızlı sermaye girişleri özellikle belirli ülkelerin büyüme kapasitelerini çok zorladı. Potansiyellerinin üzerinde büyüdüler. Potansiyellerinin üzerinde sermaye piyasalarına nakit girişi sağladı ve bu piyasalarda otomatikman fiyatların aşırı değerlenmesini sağladı. Bu dönem geçici olarak belirli impactler, belirli olumsuzluklar yaşayabiliriz. Ama nihayetine baktığımızda gelişmekte olan piyasası hikayesinin devam ettiğini düşünüyoruz. Ve özellikle gelişmiş piyasaların büyümesi gelişmekte olan piyasalar hikayesini de destekleyecektir. Seviye, değerleme seviyeleri, fiyat, kazanç veya faiz oranı seviyeleri belirleyici olacaktır. Önümüzdeki dönem daha volatil olacaktır. Ama burada özellikle biraz önce de konuşmalarda geçmişti. Eğer lokal yatırım kültürü iyi olan, lokal kurumsallaşmış, kurumsal yatırımcı bazı iyi olan, gelişmekte olan piyasalar daha az kırılgan ve daha stabil bir dönem geçirecektir. Türkiye'de ne oluyor? Konuşmamın 3. bölümünde Türkiye'deki gelişmeler ve mevcut durumu kısaca analiz etmek istedim. Türkiye'de sermaye piyasaları uzun yıllardır unutulmuştu. Çok düşük kalmıştı. Diğer gelişmekte olan sermaye piyasalarında da gerisindeydik. Bankacılık sektörüne göre de oldukça ufak. Ama son dönemdeki regülasyonlar bu süreci hızlı şekilde kapatmamızı sağlıyor. Özellikle sermaye piyasası kanunu, emeklilik kanunu, asset management, portföy yönetimi şirketlerinin ve brokerage, securities şirketlerinin yeniden yapılanması, rollerinin artması, sermaye yükümlülüklerinin artması, organizasyonel yapılarının değiştirilmesi ve finansal danışmanlık konseptlerinin ön plana çıkması çok pozitif adımlar. İkinci olumlu adım olarak emeklilik fonlarındaki gelişmelerinden bahsedebiliriz. Emeklilik fonlarında özellikle devlet katkısının gelmesiyle beraber biz önümüzdeki dönemde çok ciddi büyüme bekliyoruz. Bu özellikle düşük olan tasarruf oranını da arttıracak bir gelişme. Hisse senedi oranlarının artması, özellikle emeklilik fonlarının %15 civarında hisse senedi taşıyor. Önümüzdeki dönemde dolaylı yoldan 5-10 milyon arası yatırımcının gelmesini sağlayacak. Hazine için uzun vadeli bir borçlanma sağlayacak ve özellikle corporate bond marketinin bugün sermaye piyasalarının bir başka alanı olan gelişmesini sağlayacak. Üçüncü önemli bacağı bize göre yeni ürünler, özellikle sermaye piyasası ve emeklilik kanunları yeni ürünlerin önünü açıyor. Daha inovatif ürünler ortaya çıkabilecek. Çeşitli vadeli piyasalara uygun ürünler, faiz hassas ürünler, private equity ürünleri veya gayrimenkul fonları önümüzdeki dönemde gündeme gelecektir. Bunlar hep olumlu gelişmeler. Sermaye piyasalarının mevcut durumuna baktığımızda ise kısaca Türkiye hisse senedi piyasası tamam son 7,5 yılda çok büyüdü, 10 kat büyüdü. Ama geldiğimiz noktada bugün itibariyle sadece 400 tane hisse senedi var ve özellikle ISO 500 içerisinde sadece 83 tane hisse senedi halka açık olduğunu gözlemliyoruz. Bugün Güney Kore ve Hindistan'da 1000'in üzerinde hisse senedi halka açık durumda. Ortalama free float halka açıklık oranı %30. Bu rakamın da önümüzdeki dönemde artması gerekiyor. Bu tabii belki büyük şirketlerde halka açıklık oranı yüksek ama daha orta ölçekli şirketlerde halka açıklık oranı düşük olduğu için yabancı yatırımcı ilgisi de düşük. Dolayısıyla önümüzdeki dönemde şirket sayısının artması, free float'un artması çok önemli ve bu sayede bizim sol alttaki grafikte market cap bölü GDP olarak baktığımızda diğer gelişmekte olan piyasalara göre yolumuzun olduğunu söyleyebiliriz. Kurumsal yatırımcı çok önemli. Birazdan bununla ilgili daha detaylı bilgiler aktaracağım. Sabit getirili piyasa, özellikle bono piyasası çok oturmuş durumda. Son dönemde yabancı yatırımcı ilgisi arttı ve %25'lere kadar yükseldi. Bu yüzden kırılganlık da arttı aslında. Faiz oranlarının son dönemdeki hızlı yükselmesi ve düşmesi bunu gösteriyor. Özel sektör tahvilleri çok gelişiyor ve şu anda sermaye piyasalarının en önemli gelişen alanlarından bir tanesi. Sol altta bunun grafiğini göreceksiniz. Geçen sene 40 milyar TL'ye yakın ihraç yaşadık. Bunun likitte koşulları iyileşiyor ama henüz daha gideceğimiz çok yol var. Özel sektör tahvillerinde likitte koşullarının iyileşmesi önemli. Özel sektör tahvil yatırımcılarının yatırım yaparken olası kötü koşullarda önceliklendirilmesi de çok önemli. Bunlar konusunda da çeşitli adımlar yapılabileceğini düşünüyoruz. Son olarak sermaye piyasası gelişmesi, aracı kurumlar ve portföy yönetim şirketlerinin gelişmesiyle olacaktır. Kurumsal yatırımcıların gelişmesiyle olacaktır. Türkiye'de kurumsal yatırımcıların mevcut durumu oldukça ufak. Bugün itibariyle baktığımızda 32 milyar dolarlık büyüklük, gayri safi milli hasılanın sadece %3,5'undayız. Güney Kore, Güney Afrika, Brezilya'da %20'nin üzerinde oranlar söz konusu. Şu çıkarım çok net söyleyebiliriz. Bir İstanbul'un finans merkezi olması için sermaye piyasalarının gelişmesi ve sermaye piyasası kurumlarının da gelişmesi gerekiyor. Burada çok ciddi bir pozitif korelasyon var. Yani asset management sektörü çok önde olan ülkeler, çok önde olan şehirler, özellikle finans merkezi konusunda da bu şehirler ön plana çıkıyor. Son dönemdeki gelişmeler sektörü geliştiriyor. Asset management sektöründe düşen faiz ortamında büyümeye başladı, ihtisaslaşma başladı. Yatırımcı güveni finansal danışmanlık ve kurumsallaşma ön plana çıkıyor. Emeklilik fonlarındaki adımlar çok önemli ve önümüzdeki dönemde sermaye piyasalarının gelişmesi için 2020'de 100 milyar dolarlara ulaşabilmemiz için tasarruf oranları, yatırım kültürünün oluşması açısından çok önemli. Yatırım fonları çok önemli. Biz yatırım fonlarında çeşitli gelişimler, bu alanında teşvik edici yeni adımlar atılabileceğine inanıyoruz. Ben teşekkür ederim. Çok kısaca özetlemeye çalıştım.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alp Keler. It seems that the prospects are very high for Turkish capital markets. Last but not least, we have Harri Saukkoma. He's the member of advisory board of Taaleri Tehtas, Finland, and he's coming from a different profession. He has more than 30 years experience as media and communication professional. He's also the chairman of two consulting firms, which are Tekir and Susamuru. And he has also close links with Turkey and has a long insight in politics and economy of Turkey and Middle East. So, and he's also coming from a country which has saving surplus. So I would appreciate if you share your views on the chance of Istanbul being a financial center. Thank you very much.
Günaydın sevgili diğer arkadaşlar. Ben Türkçe'de konuşabilirim ama benim Türkçe biraz mutfak Türkçe. Bugün biraz ciddi şeyler konuşuyoruz, o için herhalde ben İngilizce devam ediyorum. Ama bu çok güzel bir toplantı vardı, çok memnun oldum buraya. Now I hope that somebody will translate my Turkish sentences also in Turkish here in the room. Yes, dear friends and colleagues, I come from a little different background, but I'm representing here Taaleri Tehdas, which is a private bank from Finland, and it has had a strong positive approach to Turkey for a long time for funds. And now Taaleri Tehdas has also started a branch in Istanbul called Taaleri Portföy, concentrating on asset management here in Turkey. And that's the position I'm looking at these things. As Mr. Chairman said, my own background is mainly in communication and media business, and so I tend to look things also through those eyeglasses. I think we should start, or I could just start telling something about Finland, which you might not remember or know. Finland has now very strong financial position in Europe, as you know, but it hasn't been always the case. We have had our own very dramatic moments in the beginning of 90s when our economy was getting a strong hiccup for different reasons. One of them was that Soviet Union was collapsing and we were having a very profitable trade with Soviet Union, but when Soviet Union disappeared, also our profitable trade disappeared. Another thing was that our banking sector was relying on the very strong local currency, and when we started to lose ground of defending local currency, then very many banks, companies and private entrepreneurs just failed to get with their commitments. It is a strong trauma still in Finland, and we are still suffering of those stories which happened that time for those entrepreneurs and companies. We remember that quite well. Also, our banking sector was cleaned up very effectively in that time. The thing which was made much more later in countries like Germany or Japan or even United States. That's the background why Finland has been quite strict when there has been discussion about how to support those countries who are now suffering in the European Union, as you probably know. We remember we have this trauma still going on, although our success story has been quite good. Now it doesn't look as good as it used to because Finland is taking even more debt than it should, and so we might have the same problems in the future. Our demographics is totally opposite to Turkish demographics. As you know, people are getting old like myself and even older, and we are trying to fight to get our fair share of pension funds in the future. Let's see how we are going to succeed. But let's start. I'm going to comment a little bit of yesterday and today, the Fed decision. Of course, I'm going to say something about the questions I was asked to concerning the implication of global liquidity and how to deal with that in the emerging markets. And finally, maybe I'm going to say something about Islamic banking, although I'm the least competent to say anything about Islamic banking or participating banking, but I will still try. In the days like today or yesterday, I always remember nice anecdote of China. There was a Western politician who went to China and he met his counterpart, prime minister or president or whoever. And in the discussion, this Western politician, they were speaking about history. He asked this Chinese counterpart, "What do you think about French Revolution, which happened in the end of 18th century?" The Chinese president or prime minister was silent for a while and said, "Too early to say." So this has been a huge media and analyst day yesterday and today. Kind of a historical things might have happened, but nobody knows what we will think about it after 1 week, after 2 weeks, or after 4 months. So it's really too early to say. Is party really over, or is it over later? We are going to see later. There are some good things, of course, and this is a good news for emerging markets. It's good news for Turkey, but there are also some specific comments which I would like to make. In general, I think it reflects that now central banks, who should make decisions independently like they are doing, they have taken a line which is a little bit more dovish or more soft, and for this given economic growth rate. Also, not only Federal Reserve, but also European Central Bank, Bank of England, Bank of Japan all of them has put that kind of statements around. And I think that central banks are not totally, I would say that they are independent, but they are not living in the plastic bubble of somewhere without politics or comments of the society. And there is a strong discussion around in the world, in the globe, that are they also guilty for this great recession that they would risk, and that's why they would risk an inflation overshoot and a growth overshoot. They would vote for the growth, and they would also take this inflation risk. So they have been reacting for that kind of surroundings. Now it appears that the Fed will come again into this business this year as what they said, and that might happen not before than December 18th when they have next meetings like that. From the communication point of view, which I like much, yesterday was a strange day because Fed was communicating something different what they really did, and it may be that they lost some of the confidence what they really need and trust in this case, but that will be seen also in the future. Confidence and trust is the key issue of all these things what we are dealing today and what we have been dealing also yesterday. What are the implications of the change in this global liquidity for the emerging capital markets? Most commonly, it's said that the reduction in this liquidity will lead negative consequences of emerging markets. But again, this is not the whole picture. There are much more complicated liaisons between these things. The current account surplus countries like China would not really be hurt. Current account deficit countries like Turkey would be affected on the financing side. However, reduction in the local liquidity would come along also with the higher growth rates in the developed markets, which should also trigger more cross-border trade and so on. So it's much more complicated picture, and this complicated picture will be clear when the dust goes down again under this turmoil, or not actually turmoil, but the discussions of these days and the huge pressure what is going around. How should regulators respond in times of similar uncertainties? I think the regulators should ensure that the existing rules and regulations in the marketplace do not incentivize market participants to take excessive risks that could potentially lead to systemic risk for the entire market. There is a huge gap of trust in this climate around financial system, and the trust is key issues. We are operating on the trust of the people, and the trust of regulators, and trust of counterparts. Designing laws that would incentivize self-regulation among free market institutions without damaging the free competition environment would be critical. If needed, some firms may and actually should be allowed to fail. We shouldn't avoid that. This is one part of the free market, and financial sector shouldn't be isolated island from the other free market activities. If the rules and regulations ensure that there is no systematic risk built up in the economy, then the failure of the single institution should not lead to a major destabilization, although it might create some temporary turbulence. Failure of certain institutions should be viewed as a part of natural selection process in the market and should eventually to lead better allocation of resources, such as human resource, financial know-how and capital. At the end of the day, capable institutions should survive, and not so capable one should exit from the market. This is kind of a Darwinistic law of jungle in many other human surroundings as well. Then finally, very short note concerning Islamic finance tools, which I admit I'm totally out of my competence, and that's why already now I apologize if my comments are totally ignorant as well. I mean, I'm totally ignorant concerning Islamic world. I have quite long experience of that, but that's a different story. Islamic finance tools are by definition based on the sharing both profits and losses in the financial transactions. For example, if an Islamic bank faces non-performing loan problem, it reflects the related losses to its deposit holders. In this setup, the damage to the equity of the Islamic bank is reduced. In a way, Islamic finance distributes the risk to wider audience, including all the related parties of the transaction. Another nature of the Islamic banking structure is that it is asset-backed. In other words, loans are always backed by assets, which leads to an automatic collateralization in the system, which is of course making more trust, making more stability in this operation. The difficulty for Islamic banks is that the conventional bank's deposit offering to their clients can be more attractive, and potential bank customer has a higher likelihood of preferring a commercial bank deposit offering a higher and certain deposit rate over a lower and not guaranteed participation bank account rate. But and as said that, I think that this discussion about Islamic bank or participation banking principles and the background is very welcome in this discussion about the financial world and its future, and especially when the discussion is concentrating on the trust issues, we are lacking all kind of different approaches for this business and different opinions in order to create a system which really would gain the trust, which is not always very easily achieved. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saukkoma. It's been 1 hour since we started, and the Bankers Forum is on the line. So I will open up to the audience for just one question, if you have any. I know you are all tired, but is there any question? No? Some closing words. Yes, sooner or later, Fed's accommodative policies will end. We all know about that. But we should focus on our advantages because our markets are still growing and offering big high yields for the investors. And as the search for yield continues worldwide, and it will continue, I guess, we will continue to attract investors worldwide. And other than focusing on such discussions, we should focus on structural reforms in emerging markets. And in Turkey, we are doing this. The Parliament enacted the new capital markets law in the last day of 2012, and we have a now very busy agenda to make the secondary regulations. And I would like to thank you all and close the discussion in the Capital Markets Forum. Thank you very much.